I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Bristol. My background is in economics, sociology, political theory, and social policy. And I research ethnic and religious inequality in the British labour market, specifically focusing on the experience of Muslims. I do this through statistical analysis, so of surveys, which is essentially data modelling through quantitative methods. My research is funded by the Economics, Social and Research Council. The Muslim penalty is essentially, the Muslim penalty is the fact that among all faith or religious groups in the UK, after accounting for human capital and demographic factors, and that essentially means things like age or education or region of residence, the Muslim community are still the ones who are most greatly impacted in terms of poorer labour market outcomes. Essentially, whether you look at wage differences, as in differences in earnings, whether you look in unemployment, probability of unemployment or probability of being inactive, or likelihood of accessing managerial posts, in each case, relative to any other faith community, Muslims are doing the worst. So I recently published a paper in Ethnic and Racial Studies, which is a peer-reviewed journal. And the paper's aim was not to establish whether a Muslim penalty exists. The literature is quite conclusive on the matter for the past 20 years. There is literature that indicates, and a majority of it that indicates that discrimination, anti-Muslim discrimination, is a large reason for why Muslims have difficulty accessing work, for example. There are other academics who are of the view that so-called cultural values or attitudes are the cause. And these things, for Muslims, are taken to stem from their religion. So they're things like, isolationist tendencies, or very religious, or gender attitudes, right? That's why, Muslims have or Muslim women have high rates of unemployment. And so in my paper, I wanted to know if this claim was supported by the evidence, as in if looking at the data, could this argument be justified? And I find no association between the increase or the likelihood of being unemployed, the likelihood of being inactive, and these so-called socio-cultural attitudes. In other words, the comparatively high Muslim unemployment rates and the comparatively high Muslim inactivity rates for men and women, so I analyze them separately, cannot be explained by these so-called socio-cultural attitudes, and it's not supported. That position is not supported by the evidence. My findings lend support to the overwhelming results from field experiments that suggest that discrimination, anti-Muslim discrimination, are a barrier to Muslims accessing work. To be clear, I'm not saying that discrimination is the only barrier or is the only issue that is being faced, and survey analysis like mine does not prove that discrimination is 100% at play. But I think that misses the point. My results, I argue, have to be seen in context of the wider body of scholarship that's available. My research is a very small piece of the puzzle. And so in that sense, if we look at results from field experiments, for example, so field experiments, the most popular one known is you have two CVs, you just change the name or indication of faith, for example. Otherwise, they're identical, and then they're sent off to jobs, and we see what callback rate is. So that's the most popular form of field experiments. And they provide strong evidence that anti-Muslim discrimination is indeed at play. A recent study in looking at, this was in 2019, looking at 4 European countries, including the UK, look at employer behavior towards different groups, and they found that, for example, anti-Muslim discrimination was indeed at play. But what's particularly important is what this study found, is that they found that Muslims who signal closeness to their faith, so signal their faith, had lower callback rates than Christians who signaled closeness to their faith, even if they were from the same country. So if you took two people from the exact same country, can't remember exactly in the study, but let's say two Arabs or two Pakistanis, or and one was Christian, one was Muslim, if both of them signaled closeness to their faith, the Muslim one had lower callback rates. And so this is persuasive evidence that the discrimination is particularly focused at Muslims, and not, as some like to claim, it's an uneasiness with religion in general, right? It's focused at a particular religion. There's another recent study in 2017 that even in cosmopolitan London, applicants with a Muslim name will receive 3 times fewer callback rates than those with a Christian names. This is in London, and this was done on the BBC in 2017, and the research was led by Professor Tariq Madood at Bristol. There's also, if we look at the evidence of racist views in our society, lend further evidence, I think, to the discrimination thesis. So in 2014, we had the European Social Survey, and it found that 18% of Britons, so nearly 1 in 5, believed, and I quote, that some races or ethnic groups are born less intelligent. That's 1 in 5 people believe that, right? There's research since the late that looks at research from the late 1960s up till, I believe, 2017, that has found that discrimination towards those who identify as Black and South Asians has not changed over that period. So it's difficult, I think, to sort of just look at a piece of research in silo. We know, for example, that, again, research from 2017 that shows that ethnic minorities that otherwise have inclusive views about other groups also have particularly strong views against Muslims, right? So it's not just the majority group, but also other ethnic minorities towards Muslims. And if you look at representation in the media, right? So Professor Baker at Lancaster in 2013 did a study looking at the word Muslim in the British press from 1998, I believe, till 2009, so a relatively long period of time. And he found that how Muslims were represented, they were either as alienated, in conflict with other Muslims, easily offended. If you look at the Centre for Media Monitoring at the Muslim Council of Britain, they did a study of 10,000 articles in Q4 2018, and they find that what is the most common theme that comes up with Muslim? Terrorism. Over a third of articles misrepresent all Muslims. 59% of articles have a negative behavior. So that said, it's true that holding racist views does not necessarily translate into action, right? Those two things don't necessarily follow. But to argue that they don't have an influence on our decisions, such as employment decisions or hiring decisions, is to suggest that somehow employment is negotiated in some abstract vacuum, and I don't think that's a plausible argument to make. And so in that sense, it's not to say, again, that discrimination is the only driver, but what I'm saying is that when we take the evidence, analyze all in combination, in addition to my findings that refute this so-called socio-cultural argument, it's difficult to then argue that discrimination, or to not see that discrimination plays a role in this Muslim penalty. From an academic perspective, or in the academic circles, it's been well received. I've been privileged to get quite a few people reach out over people I don't know reach out over email, send encouraging notes. Academics who I've read, sort of 10 years ago, who I think are experts in the methods, sort of sending encouraging notes. People telling me that it's been read in the US and sort of outside the UK. And if you look at altmetrics, was essentially tracks and monitors reach and impact online, so not through citations, the traditional way. the paper currently ranks in sort of the top 5% of impactful papers ever tracked, and you're talking about 22 million pieces of research output. So in that sense, yeah, obviously for me it's good news, but more broadly, the hope is that it actually contributes to even a little bit against this, to fight against this narrative through empirical evidence of that problematizes the Muslims in the UK. It's not enough to do well in areas which we think will impact or have positive labour market outcomes. So essentially, having a degree, for example, living in an area, let's say like London, that has more opportunities than other areas, is not enough in order to access work. As I mentioned, even in cosmopolitan London, those with a Muslim name or applicants with a Muslim name secure three times fewer callbacks. So in essence, you have to work harder than your peers who have, white or Christian sounding names. But I think it's particularly at this point, one thing I'd like to highlight, we've just had news of a recession, right? Sort of biggest impact since the financial crisis in 2008. And we know that there's other evidence that ethnic minorities experience hypercyclical patterns of unemployment. What that essentially means is that during a recession, their unemployment rate goes up faster than the majority group. My research looked at 10 years of data using Understanding Society, which is a longitudinal study, so one of the largest of its kind, but it looked at between 2009 and 2020. So we took an average rate. So if we think that in, if you like, normal times, access to work was already impeded and was more difficult for those who identify as Muslim, during a recession, the risk of unemployment for all groups increases, but it does so even more so for ethnic minorities, which includes Muslims. So it would be a particularly challenging time. The third point I would make in terms of what this means for the workforce is that it can lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms. So there is information, or we have research on, for example, people whitening their CVs. And to whiten your CVs essentially means either to hide your ethnicity or to hide your association with your faith. So let's say somebody has volunteered at a mosque or at a Muslim organization, they remove that. So that not only makes them appear less qualified because they have experience which they don't share, but it also can have a mental health impact in terms of repressing your identity. And that's essentially one of the other things. We've seen information or incidents of people not divulging that they're Muslim, for example. And again, what does that mean? That means that you don't ask for time to pray at work, you don't ask for Friday prayer, you don't ask for your time off for Eid, you don't wear markers of your face, such as your hijab, for example. And so again, all these things have a mental, have effects on our mental well-being. And then there's one way could also be to lead to widening the net strategy. And this is essentially where people who are qualified will apply for jobs where they are overqualified because they think that at least that one I will get. And that obviously impacts career progression. It impacts also your self-esteem, right? Because you're not reaching your full potential. And more broadly, there's this idea also of the chill factor, which is essentially you don't apply to certain roles or you don't apply to certain industries because you just assume you'll be rejected. So you just don't do it. And all that has serious impacts, as I said, on our mental health. Yeah, so my hope is that through my research, it's to shed light on a social inequality so that we better know how to address it. And is essentially for policy ultimately to be evidence-led, to rely on rigorous academic and consensus therein work rather than feeling or bias. So in this particular context, for example, right, of my study, is that to still insist that it's so-called culture that is the most important driver of why Muslim men and Muslim women experience poorer labour market outcomes, despite body of literature over the past 50 years, some of which we discussed, showing that racism and discrimination plays an important role in limiting access to work. And despite my findings that these so-called socio-cultural attitudes do not appear to have any effect on the Muslim penalty, I think it's more of an ideological stance than one supported by the evidence, and it will only reinforce social inequality because it will delay work to actually resolve some of those problems. And there is a body of literature in terms of how racism impacts mental health. We know that there is inequality in housing. In short, our labour market experience impacts every part of our life. It impacts where we can live, it impacts what we eat, and therefore our health, how much we can give our children. And I don't mean just in terms of wealth, but how much we can invest in education. So any plan to tackle social inequality more broadly must have tackling labour market inequalities as a central pillar of this strategy. I mean, generally speaking, there have been solutions which include more formalised and transparent application process, so it can be name blind, for example, or electronic applications, for instance, so that you basically reduce referrals, which tend to favour majority groups, to have clear job requirements, clear pay structures. But there are more targeted ones, and all the points I'm making come from the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain report, which also known as the PARC report, which was published in 2000. So what I'm saying essentially is not new, it's not from me, we know this, it's out there. The report wasn't well received at the time, but I still think it makes for a fascinating read and is very, very relevant for our situation today still. Unfortunately. So they will suggest things like cultivating strong and dedicated leadership. And what that means is at the helm to deal with racism and such as Islamophobia is taken seriously at the top, changing the occupational culture. This idea that you have this sort of cynicism about so-called political correctness needs to be actually actively challenged. Effective training and not awareness training. So this is one of the points, was essentially saying that it's not to make aware that, let's say, that racism exists, but actually its causal mechanisms and how they play out. What does institutional racism actually look like? The fact that there are different types of racism: anti-black racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Gypsy. There are a number of different facets. I think data collection is also a very important one, not just on ethnicity and gender, but religion. But I think that needs to be done also in a proper way. Collecting data on Asians or BAME is not help. There's much heterogeneity within these groups. And so I think that data collection needs to happen at every level to monitor promotions, to monitor people who are shortlisted, to monitor new recruits, but done effectively. And ties back to the point I made previously, is to implement evidence-based policies, right? Your worldviews or your bias is not evidence. And if we continue to refuse to acknowledge that, for example, racism or discrimination works in a company despite the body of evidence, well, that's obviously poses a problem. There's also proposals of adopting a diverse recruitment and promotion process. And this doesn't just mean diversity in religion and ethnicity, but also across for different departments, right? So you get more people involved. And I think one important one is involving Muslims in programs as both managers and advisors. So if a government, for example, in this case, or even a company is trying to combat, let's say, Muslim unemployment, have a Muslim there that is sensitive to people's background and aspirations, rather than assume what you think is your vision of the good life applies to everyone. And I think the final one, which is important, is genuinely valuing diversity and equality. And by that I mean, if we look at appraisals, are these things rewarded? Or if they're just on the margins and nobody's going to be rewarded for them, then nobody's going to spend as much time. But if you're genuinely rewarded for them, then you will put effort into actually promoting them. And as I said again, these are all suggestions that come since 2020 by the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain. So the information is there, and it has been there for a while. In my PhD research, what I'm currently working on is to offer a more complete view of religious inequalities in the British labour market, one that goes beyond simply only looking at, let's say, unemployment, employment differences, to be able to have a better understanding of how it functions in the British labour market, and therefore to be able to propose more focused policies